I want to move now to this question, which is just far too big to actually answer this question in this lecture. What is atonement? Okay. One of the things that I want to suggest in the course of this lecture is that atonement is really a multifaceted and highly complex term. It holds a lot of things together. And right in the fact that it can hold so many things together, it can also create a good bit of conceptual confusion, or at least I want to argue that. Now, I don't know if this is a problem outside of English language discourse in the ways that I will talk about. I suspect it is, but forgive me if in Danish you make distinctions that in English we tend not to. But one of the things that we'll look at in the course of this lecture, albeit briefly, is the fact that certain English language translation traditions, mainly coming from William Tyndale, actually present something in their translations themselves that is not present if you were just reading, say, Septuagint and New Testament Greek. But we'll come to that point, okay? So there's some confusion that we'll discuss. The thesis, as it were, of this lecture is that we need to recognize that there are important distinctions to be observed between atonement, broadly defined, and broadly defined I mean in terms of all of Jesus' salvific work, the atonement, and sacrificial atonement, which is a more particular work of covenant maintenance. Okay? I hope that as we move through this lecture, you'll see this thesis being unpacked. And I hope it's persuasive, but I'm quite happy if you have questions and want to push back on some of this. But I find that people often, scholars even, often talk past each other because this language of atonement almost becomes a kind of magical terminology where we don't completely know exactly what it is we're referring to that's going on, as it were, behind the scenes. Maybe even the denotation or meaning of the term. But I hope that this lecture will help bring some clarity to that, okay? All right, so as I've already suggested, there is some conceptual confusion around this terminology, especially the English term atonement. Now, the word in its root, I mean, etymology is often a bad way to try and understand words. I hope we have all learned that in our basic exegesis courses, right? In English, right, if you do an etymology on a butterfly, you don't learn very much about a butterfly. But in the case of atonement, the etymology basically works because it's built kind of like, I don't know about Danish, but certainly like maybe more along the lines of German. You can actually build words out of the various parts. That's what atonement is. At one meant. Okay? It basically means to reconcile, to bring aggrieved parties together, parties that were at odds in some way, to bring them together so that they are at one, atone. Okay? But there are two ways that this language of atonement is often used in theological discourse. By the way, there may be more ways, and I'm not trying to exclude, but there are two that we'll focus on here that can create some confusion. The first is that this language, at least in English theological discourse, has come to serve as a sort of larger umbrella term that holds underneath it all of the different things that the biblical text talks about as creating problems that keep God and humanity at a distance from each other. I'll unpack this a bit more. But there is a tendency, to put this in different terms, to use the language of the atonement as if it were basically synonymous with a Christian doctrine of soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. The atonement can be used to name everything that gets tossed into the hopper of this is what salvation is. So all the work that Jesus does to save people can be viewed under the rubric of the atonement. And that work also then tends to be reduced or focused on Jesus' passion and crucifixion. The cross is often assumed to be where all the work of atonement is completed. And texts like John 19:31, when Jesus says from the cross, "It is finished," tend to become proof texts that demonstrate that all Jesus' salvific work is done as he expires on the cross. I want to challenge that, okay? But nevertheless, we're just getting started here to try and think about some of the ways that this language of atonement is used. A second way in which the language has come to be used in English is to refer to a feature of Levitical sacrifice that aims to solve, in particular, the problems of sin and guilt. And I should have added here also certain instances of impurity or uncleanness, okay? These overlap in certain ways. We'll talk about briefly, but this may be an area we'd want to pursue a bit more. We'll see. Okay, but in any case, you have these two major ways of talking about atonement. One as a big doctrinal soteriological category, that's all of Jesus' saving work, in effect, and the other as an element of Jewish sacrifice, something that happens when you offer certain kinds of sacrifices to the Lord. Now, there's a common metaphor that, again, in English discourse, one runs across. I do not know if you have it here, but I'm going to work with it because I think it can help us see certain problems and issues that we have to resolve or think through at least. And that is to think of the cross as a kind of gemstone that has multiple facets. Or I've also heard this metaphor described in a different way. Imagine that the cross is you standing in a room with windows that look out in all different directions. And you look out one window, you see one thing, another window, you see another thing. But the cross is the center. The cross is the gemstone. And as you look through the facets, you can see different things. Okay? So when the atonement is used to describe as this umbrella kind of term, you can think of each facet within this metaphor, within this gemstone, as a biblical image that aims to make concrete some aspect of the abstract problem and solution that keeps God and humanity apart. Now, I'm not opposed to metaphor. I've had people push back on some of the things I've argued, like, well, you're opposed to metaphor. I mean, I don't even know what that would mean. I mean, at some level, all language is, of course, metaphorical. But what I want to pursue here is whether or not thinking about these different problems in particular biblical contexts, whether or not metaphor is the best way to try and approach these. I've already begun to try and challenge that a bit by noting that there's real physical directionality involved in the Jewish temple complex when you offer a sacrifice to God. It's not reducible just to the thought. Okay? It's not just metaphor. You actually give a gift to the Lord. That's sacrifice. Okay? So I'm going to try and push this out a bit as we think about atonement. But let's continue to think through the metaphor side of things. There is a way of reflecting on different biblical images as if they're metaphors for naming certain concrete problems that help us conceptualize things that keep us away from God. For example, one of the major images that runs straight through the Old Testament biblical text and very much into the New Testament text is this idea of enslavement. It's a problem that has to be resolved. So you can think about, I mean, this goes all the way back to the Exodus. The people are enslaved to a power, and they have to be redeemed, or even indeed ransomed from this power in some way, so that they can have relationship with God. Okay, you can use that as one facet to think about the cross. Another one might be an offense. You did some, God said don't do it, and you did it. And there's an offense or a sin, and it has to be forgiven. That could be another facet within the gemstone. The metaphor of a burden that one bears that needs to be removed. Or of a stain or an impurity that's created, which needs to be cleansed or purified. Perhaps you can think in terms of guilt and sin as things that need to be punished, and wrath, so that God is satisfied somehow. Okay? All of these things can be conceptualized as looking at the cross and sort of viewing it through these different facets, different biblical stories and images. Okay, yes, they can be used metaphorically. I'm not trying to deny that. But this can all be a way of suggesting that what happens when Jesus dies is somehow resolving all of these different problems. And that really what underlies all these problems is a single, more abstract problem. It's really about a moral failure somehow, to use our language of sin to name this. And that this moral failing is really at the core of keeping God and humanity separate. And it has to be resolved. And the solution is the cross. Jesus dies on the cross, and it resolves that fundamental problem. And so you can think of each of these facets as resolving then. You're freed from enslavement. The guilt is taken and the burden is taken away. The stain is washed away, etc. Okay? Now, that's, of course, the one way of using this language. The other is using this language in terms of Levitical sacrifice to name something that happens at a particular part of the larger process that we looked at that is dealing with the particular problems that Jewish sacrifice might be trying to resolve within the context of the covenant relationship. Now, I'm trying to suggest here that one of the problems with one of the things that creates conceptual confusion when we use this same term to name all these different problems and all these different biblical problems and all these different biblical solutions, sort of soteriology on the one hand, but also to name some very specific things that are going on with Jewish sacrifice, is that this creates a number of reductions. Certain things are getting reduced to basically one thing. All the problems in this Christian discourse can sometimes be viewed as being resolved by the single event of the crucifixion. I want to suggest already that that's a kind of reduction. And just as to anticipate some things that we're going to think about throughout the rest of these lectures, in some respects, someone like Irenaeus is already onto this problem. Because Irenaeus is famous in some ways for thinking about the idea that Jesus has to live a full human life to resolve a whole set of different problems. It's not all resolved simply by the crucifixion. Now, I'm not suggesting that what's often called a recapitulation theory of the atonement is the right account of the atonement. I'm simply trying to signal that what I'm arguing is not in its core new. That there are actually ancient Christian theological approaches to some of these questions and problems that have already been thinking in some ways, pretty clear-headedly about the fact that you need more than just the crucifixion. Okay? But anyway, back to where we were in this lecture. There is a kind of reduction that can occur in some accounts of soteriology, whereby all the problems that keep God and humanity apart are solved by the singular event of the crucifixion. The cross is the center. The cross does all the work, and this includes the work of sacrifice. Not least when we go back to some of the modern assumptions that we looked at in the last lecture, not least when sacrifice is assumed to itself be reducible to the act of slaughtering or killing something. When we use the language of sacrifice to basically mean killing something, which at least in English discourse is quite common, there's a reduction there, because suddenly you're not actually thinking about the whole process of sacrifice. If we could put this in a different way, if you were to ask a Second Temple Jew if they went to the temple and slaughtered their animal and then took the blood and the fat and left, did they offer a sacrifice? I think their answer would be, well, of course not. It wouldn't even occur to them. Not unlike the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, like where you have these pictures of Isaac next to the altar. They just have different assumptions. They think about how these things work because they've seen them. They've participated in them. And they know that you don't offer a sacrifice just by killing something. There has to be more. But we tend, I suggest, to reduce sacrifice simply to things like slaughter. And we tend to think that whatever then is going on with sacrifice when you kill something, that in some way the death of Jesus is directly correlated with that, and this is solving all of the problems. Now, there are roots in the English translation tradition that, as I already suggested, go back to Tyndale and his translations of the New Testament, and then subsequently of the Old Testament into English. Again, I'm not intending to, beat down on Tyndale, but I want to at least raise some questions and have a conversation, because he's making some moves that have actually brought us to the point where we have this use of atonement in these two different ways that we've looked at, okay? Important to note here is that Tyndale begins his translation work with the Greek New Testament. So he first translates the Greek New Testament into the English of his day. He's working on this apparently in 1524, 1525, and he publishes the first edition of this New Testament in English in 1526. Now, he makes some important moves here, especially in texts like Romans 5:11 and 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 20. Here, he translates certain terms that Paul uses, of course, in Greek. These are the verb katalasso and the noun katalage. These are terms that mean to reconcile. And he translates them with this language of atonement. Now that is a perfectly good and reasonable translation, okay? It names something about reconciling God and humanity. And of course, Paul, by the way, I'm not even trying to dispute this, Paul focuses in these passages on the death of Jesus as making reconciliation. So Tyndale does not invent this language of atonement. It's already present, and I strongly suspect, although I haven't tracked this down enough to say with authority, but I strongly suspect it's already present in certain theological discourse. That is to say, I'm not sure Tyndale invents what happens here, but because he translates this into English, and because these translations become the core of especially the King James Version, this language has a major impact, major influence on what happens in English theological discourse, okay? So, when he's looking at these texts in Paul, he's seeing Jesus' death bringing reconciliation, or as it were, making atonement between God and humanity. Now, where things get really interesting is when he then turns his attention to translating the Hebrew Bible into English. He's working on this apparently in the 1530s. I mean, who knows? He may have been playing around with this stuff. I don't know how systematic he was. But at least when we seem to know about him really working on it, it's in the 1530s. So it's after he publishes his Greek New Testament in English. And he never completes this project because he's killed for his efforts. Now, one of the things that he often did when he's working in Torah, especially as he's working through Leviticus, is translate the Hebrew verb kippur with variations of the phrase to make atonement or to reconcile. So it's clear that he sees these as synonymous, reconcile and to make atonement, okay? So he, in Tyndale's translation, the Levitical priests, at certain points in, say, Leviticus 4, and again, especially in Leviticus 16, the Levitical priests make atonement at the altar when they offer sacrifices and sins are forgiven. This verb, kippur, in Hebrew, is rendered by Tyndale often with language of to make atonement. This creates something for an English reader that it's important for us to notice. Because now, an English reader who reads Tyndale's translation, who reads Leviticus 4, sees a priest making atonement at the altar, but then when he reads Romans 5:11 and 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 20, he sees Jesus' death making atonement. The same language is being used by Tyndale. So it creates a kind of assumption that what happens with the death of Jesus is in some way the same kind of thing, if not the same thing, that happens when a priest does something at an altar in offering sacrifice. Okay? Jesus' death is presented as doing what Levitical sacrifice does. Tyndale's choice, I think, helps lead us to or fosters the kind of reductionism and conceptual confusion that I mentioned above. Again, I'm not saying Tyndale is the source of this, but this is how I think the language really becomes what it does in English theological discourse. And it's worth noting here that the point that I was just making about bringing Romans 5:11 and 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 20 together with Leviticus 4, Leviticus 16, is something that's introduced into the translation tradition, as far as I can tell, by Tyndale himself. That is to say, the translation traditions that precede Tyndale do not use the same terms to think about what's going on with Paul's language in Romans 5 and with the language that's used in the Hebrew text in Leviticus 4, for example, okay? So Tyndale's Bible has Paul, as it were, using Jewish sacrificial language to talk about Jesus' death. But when we look at, say, the Greek Bible tradition, here we have a translation in the so-called Septuagint, where ancient Greek and Hebrew speakers are actually rendering Hebrew into Greek. The Septuagint translation, I happen to think this, okay, so I love this kind of stuff. It's one of the things that got me into New Testament, okay? But I happen to think this is really important, because what we see is a kind of pattern that emerges in Septuagint, whereby the Septuagint translators never render the Hebrew verb kippur with the Greek verb katalasso. It doesn't occur in these sacrificial contexts. If I've missed something, please let me know. But it just doesn't occur. That's not the word that they go to. And in fact, they don't even use cognates of katalasso. This is reconciliation is not the idea, at least not in this direct lexical sense, that they reach for when they translate kippur into their Greek texts. They reach for exiloskomai, which we don't really have time to explore, but it's a fascinating term that they choose to typically, this is no one-to-one here, but typically render kippur in sacrificial contexts. Yeah, we probably should just move on for the sake of time. But that means that if you're reading a Greek Bible, you read Septuagint, and you read Leviticus 4, you're seeing exilaskomai as the verb that happens when a priest is doing something at an altar. And then you go to Paul, and you read katalasso. You don't make necessarily the same direct lexical link that Tyndale's translation allows an English reader to make between that sacrificial activity and what Paul's talking about, say in Romans 5 or 2 Corinthians 5. Okay? Now, I think that Tyndale's choice creates at times an unnoticed tautology. I alluded to this earlier when I talked about the language of atonement almost being magical. Like, what does the word mean? It becomes this sort of like term that names some kind of mystery. And fair enough, there's all kinds of mystery going on in salvation. Again, I'm not trying to critique that. But it creates a kind of tautology in Levitical sacrifice because, I suggest, it replaces a mechanism, kippur, that occurs when a priest does certain things at an altar, not exclusively, but primarily. It replaces the mechanism with the goal of restored relationship. So, in effect, Tyndale's translation conceptually leads to the following understanding of what happens in Levitical sacrifice when you offer an atoning sacrifice. Okay? I think, in effect, Tyndale's translation doesn't exactly say this, but it leads us conceptually to the following conclusion. A priest makes atonement on the altar in order to make atonement. What does it mean? I don't know. What is the priest doing on the altar? He's making atonement. Why does he do it? To make atonement. Okay, red is red. Wonderful. But it's a tautology, I suggest. Now, you could say, like, he's making reconciliation on the altar to make reconciliation, but I think we're right back in this tautologist situation. What exactly is kippur? What exactly is atonement that the priest is doing on the altar? Let me offer an illustration that might help explain this a bit further. Doors use all kinds of different mechanisms to lock. The first time I ever encountered a fob as opposed to a key that you put on a sensor to unlock a door, I was totally lost. I knew exactly what the situation was. The door was in the state of being locked, and I needed to get in. I needed the door to be unlocked. But I had no idea how to unlock the door. Why? Because I didn't know how the mechanism worked. Okay? Now, there are different mechanisms. You can use hydraulics, you can use a latch, a bolt, all kinds of different ways that a door can be locked. If I tell someone, get up and please go lock the door, they will understand exactly what the final state of that door ought to be. But if they don't know the mechanism, they're going to have a very hard time actually doing what they're asked to do. Okay? That was the situation I found myself in. I didn't know how to unlock the door. I knew it was locked. I knew what that meant. I knew what the consequences of that were. I didn't know the mechanism. I suggest that the translation of kippur with to make atonement, and insofar as it creates this tautology, is obscuring the mechanism. It does not allow, at least again in English discourse, it does not allow us to see what mechanism is going on at the altar. It tells us what the goal is, and that's not bad, but it doesn't tell us how to get to the goal. You still have a locked door, conceptually. Okay? All right. Now, what then is sacrificial atonement? Please note that I am intentionally qualifying this language to try and help us move away, partly because I don't think we can lose, at least in English, I don't think we can lose the language of atonement. I'm going to argue in brief that, and I'm borrowing from some Hebrew Bible scholars here, that the mechanism is largely one of removing something, which is why you get language of cleaning and purification and taking a burden and things like that. It's largely related to the removal of something, okay? But, you know, if you want to try and engage the current conversation, you can't just go in and write a book on rethinking purification, because nobody cares. But atonement is the language we use. And I'm not sure we can give up on it. And I'm not even saying it's bad. But in order to try and clarify, to try and make these distinctions that I've argued can create confusion if we don't make them, I'm qualifying what happens with Leviticus in terms of sacrificial atonement. Here I am trying to narrow down the focus, not thinking about all the salvific stuff that Jesus does, but thinking about what sacrifice does when we use this language of atonement, okay? Atonement, this verb kippur, is a priestly activity that at times in these sacrificial texts is clearly associated with ideas of purification, of a cleaning in some way, a removal. Now, it's important here to note that impurity is not always about moral infraction. Again, in the Second Temple Jewish world, impurity is not exclusively a metaphor. It is actually something that is a part of the human condition. And it is closely related to issues surrounding mortality. It's not limited to that. It can be used metaphorically to refer to moral infraction, creating some kind of stain or impurity that seems especially to want to attach itself to God's house. It makes God's house dirty. But it's more than that, okay? It also is a feature of the human condition. And we especially see this in texts like Leviticus 12, also Leviticus 14. But in Leviticus 12, when a woman gives birth, she is impure. There is no sin. There is no moral infraction involved in what happens there. Indeed, you could view it as, in fact, obeying one of God's commands to be fruitful and multiply. And yet, in the course of giving birth, impurity arises. And while not all of this kind of what some scholars will call ritual impurity, to try and distinguish it between the moral from the moral side of things, not all of this is resolved by sacrifice, not by a long shot. But some of it is. And in the case of Leviticus 12, for example, the way in which the woman can become pure, there's debates about this, of course, right? But it involves her offering what we would call today a sin offering. She needs to actually make a sin offering to bring about a state of purity. This almost certainly applies to the temple, but I and some others would argue it applies to herself as well, which means that the sacrifice is itself doing some kind of work of purification. But this is not a moral problem. She's not guilty of a sin. She gave birth and needs to offer a sacrifice. Some other ways, just very briefly, that we see this playing out relative to mortality are things like the fact that a dead body has a certain highly contagious kind of impurity around it. And everybody is allowed to, in fact, burying the dead is a very good thing. I mean, Tobit is all about this, right? But the high priest, in particular, is not allowed to attend a funeral. He's not allowed to come close to a corpse. Why? Well, probably because he's the individual who comes closest to the presence of God. So there's some sense here in which impurity, whether it's from sin or these issues of mortality, keeps God and humanity at a distance. Okay? And this is resolved in part by sacrifice, and in particular, this language of atonement. And when we look at some specific texts, it's very hard to generalize this stuff because the details there are many of them, and not every text says exactly the same thing. But there tends to be a pattern of linking what's going on with this kippur, or make atonement language, and impurity and cleansing ideas. In Leviticus 16, for example, the Day of Atonement text, the high priest goes into the holy place and makes atonement for the holy place. Already we should notice this, right? The holy place, did it sin? No. But something is happening to the holy place itself based on what the priest is doing, and it's done because of the impurity or uncleanness of the people. That implies that the holy place is getting a good cleaning, a good fall clean. That's a pun, because in English we talk about a spring clean. I don't know if you have this here, but this is a fall clean. In the fall, the holy place and the temple gets cleaned. Okay? And we see the link even more directly toward the end of this passage, the next highlighted point. When the priest sprinkles some of the blood with his finger 7 times, this is on the altar of incense, and he purifies, he cleanses it. He cleanses the altar from the impurity of the people. Jacob Milgram in particular has famously argued that sin and impurity create a stain on God's house, on his furniture. And it has to be regularly cleaned, because God doesn't want his house to be all mucked up. Okay? I think there's a lot to that thesis that's highly compelling. In Leviticus 16:30, again, we have a kind of summary of everything that's happened in the Day of Atonement ritual. The text says, on this day, atonement, kippur, is made for you. Why? To purify you, and you shall be clean or pure before the Lord from all your sins. So it's not just God's house that's getting purified, it's also the people. There is something that goes on, and kippur is naming in some way this mechanism. It looks like it's a mechanism of cleaning, of removing something that is creating a stain or something unclean or impure. Atonement then, in this sacrificial sense, when it's made by a priest by way of sacrifice, appears to primarily be a mechanism that purifies in some way. It is important to note here that the use of blood is central in this process of cleaning things up. It doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but this is the ancient conception. Blood in Leviticus 17:11 is as close as we get in the entire Hebrew Bible to appearing to name a logic that underlies the mechanism. The life of the flesh is in the blood. And God says, I have given it to you, I've given it for you on the altar to kippur for your lives. For it is the blood that kippurs. Why? Because of the life. The idea seems to be that the life in the blood has the power to purify or clean certain things when they need that cleaning. Again, Jacob Milgram has talked about blood as a kind of ancient detergent. And I think that's helpful in a way. So there's a hand in the back.
Thank you for talking about this uncleanliness. I recently read Leviticus for the... Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
For the first time, and it almost killed me. But I got through it. And my number one question was always about the uncleanliness. How is there a difference, and why is a woman at fault for having a menstruation or giving birth, right? But when you talk about sin and uncleanliness as separate things, can we not go one layer deeper and say they are both, like the root of both of them is death, like you mentioned with the corpse, and the wages of sin are death?
Yeah, I mean...
Blood is the antidote because it's life.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I think there are ways of reading Paul as making that kind of argument, okay? So yes, I think there are ways theologically that we can reflect on that. Maybe, as it were, even a hierarchy within these things. But if we at least step back into Leviticus, we don't seem to see Leviticus concerned with that same level of hierarchy, but rather concerned to think about how to negotiate, bringing people into the presence of God when you have two problems that overlap, one of, to use our language, morality, and one of mortality, okay? So at the moment, I'm trying to leave it there. We'll talk a bit about Paul, and you can maybe push back on some of those arguments, okay? All right. So as we continue to think this through, and I realize time is moving quickly, I at least want to suggest that the mechanism then there is a mechanism of removing some offensive thing from God's house in particular, not least the altars, but ultimately also from the offerers. But here, at least in Leviticus 16:19, we see clearly that there's something on the altar that needs to be removed. And part of what this helps us see is that this is much bigger than just a question of morality, because I presume at least that the altar is not sinning, and yet it needs to be purified, okay? All right. The removal of this offensive thing seems to create the conditions for a restored relationship. And in this sense, theologically speaking, it's not improper to use the language of reconcile, the way Tyndale wants to do, with a reference to the Levitical sacrificial system. It's just not lexically what's going on in the text themselves. So if we look at, for example, Leviticus 4:10, the priest makes atonement, he compares for the people, and the people are forgiven. I am not alone here, but want to suggest that there's actually a kind of first, the offensive thing is removed, and then God is willing to grant forgiveness. Now let me say very clearly, once again, God is not bound by this system. It's not as if God has to wait around for this to happen before forgiveness. It's more that within the context of the covenant, God has said, here is a means by which these things can be negotiated and forgiveness can be offered. But none of what I'm suggesting or arguing is intended to preclude God acting in ways that are not sacrificial to bring forgiveness. It's just, I'm not trying to run a new reduction, okay? But nevertheless, when we look at sacrifice, these seem to be the ideas in Levitical sacrifice that appear to be in play. The mechanism, kippur, is leading to restored relationship. There is a reconciliation that occurs in the relationship. So if we translate kippur more along the lines of, say, purification, then we could argue conceptually that purification then leads to reconciliation, atonement. This is a way then of trying to decouple the confusion that I think Tyndale's translation creates. And yet we're still left with many English translations in the wake of Tyndale, particularly in Leviticus, that will render kippur with this language of to make atonement, okay? Now, this mechanism, I think, could be viewed as an essential element that helps maintain covenant relationship. Sacrificial atonement, in other words, is all about relational maintenance, about resolving certain problems that keep God and humanity apart. If those points are basically right, then I think some important conclusions follow. 1, atoning sacrifice is solving certain problems created by sin and impurity by removing the offense that these problems create. 2, atoning sacrifice solve these problems, and this I think is really key, within the covenant relationship. Prior to the covenant relationship, and here I'm talking about the Mosaic covenant, prior to that relationship being established, there is no tabernacle, there are no Levitical priests, and there are, this is by definition, no Levitical sacrifices. Before the Exodus, none of this exists. These things, the tabernacle, the priesthood, the sacrifices, at least if we take the Torah, the Pentateuchal account, seriously. I'm not trying to ask historical questions here. I'm trying to think theologically through the text, not least because the early Christians wouldn't know about the sources of the Pentateuch. They're going to read the Pentateuch potentially in a certain kind of linear fashion. I think we see Paul doing this, for example. There is no tabernacle, priesthood, or sacrifice before the Exodus. There are people doing sacrificial things, Genesis 22. But there is no Levitical sacrifice until the covenant is established. And then tabernacle and sacrifice and priesthood are functioning within the covenant relationship. But this then suggests, 3, that sacrificial atonement is not solving all the problems that keep God and humanity apart, right? Because if this is correct, then notice that Levitical sacrifice does not bring redemption from enslavement. You are not redeemed from enslavement in Egypt by Levitical priests offering Levitical sacrifices at the tabernacle. These things don't exist yet. Now, I didn't just say that there aren't sacrificial things involved with that redemption, but I'm trying to zero in on what's going on in Leviticus and notice that this occurs within the covenant. It is not the thing that even establishes the covenant. It is rather something that functions within it to help maintain the covenant. And it is worth noting here, and I will try to be brief, that the Passover itself is not an atoning sacrifice. Passover does not kippur. It does not make atonement. That is worth reflecting on. There is something that happens there, and it is sacrificial in its way. But later rabbinic sources, at least some of them, actually look at Passover and ask a question that might never occur to us to ask. How is that sacrifice? For us, we just look, obviously it's sacrifice. But at least some ancient Jewish thinkers look at Passover and say, obviously it's not sacrifice. Why do they have to say it's sacrifice? Because the text says it. Pesach tzevach, the Passover sacrifice. So they have to think, okay, this is somehow sacrifice, but it doesn't look like anything that we would normally think of as sacrifice. That's, again, just a way of showing us that our assumptions might be too quickly reading things in that some others just don't see as self-evident. All right, I'm coming to an end of this lecture. how does all of this potentially relate to the question of Jesus' salvific work? And we'll spend the rest of these lectures looking at New Testament and beyond, okay? I want to suggest some proposals. Atonement as a big umbrella term recognizes that there are numerous problems identified in the Bible that keep God and humanity apart. Let's take a few: enslavement, sin, impurity. And it also recognizes that these involve numerous solutions: redemption, forgiveness, purification. But sacrificial atonement allows us a narrower focus on some of these problems, especially problems that relate to the ongoing covenant relationship with God. Now, if that's right, or at least barking up the right tree, as it were, then I want to make the following suggestion. We should be focused more on the person of Jesus, and not just on a single event, like the crucifixion, as essential and important as the crucifixion is. I'm not in any way saying that the cross doesn't matter. I'm not in any way saying that the cross is not salvific. What I am arguing is that the cross is not the whole thing. That the only category big enough to solve all of the problems is not the single event of Jesus' death. It's Jesus himself. He is the only category, as it were, big enough to hold all the solutions to all the problems together. This is where I think Irenaeus really was already onto something important in our theological reflection. So, if this is right-headed, it allows us to think about salvific, if we want to use atonement in the broad sense, atoning aspects of Jesus' death. But it also allows us to think about salvific, or as it were, atoning aspects in things like his resurrection and his ascension, and as you'll know from the titles of this lecture, his ongoing intercession, which we'll come to a bit more tomorrow. Now, the remainder of these lectures then, I'm going to broadly be arguing that Jesus' work of sacrificial atonement, something that aligns with what we see in Leviticus, is an ongoing reality that is linked with his ongoing high priestly ministry before the Father. Which is a way of saying, and here I just want to briefly anticipate a point, that Jesus' work of intercession right now is as essential for salvation as was the work that he did when he died on the cross. And here Hebrews 7:25 gives us a hook for the lectures tomorrow. Hebrews 7:25 says that Jesus is able to save his people completely because he always lives to intercede for them. What good is an incomplete salvation? Let's end with that for today, and we'll pick up tomorrow.
Thank you, David. I think we'll take time just for one or two quick questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was wondering how you think this might change how we view Paul's language in Romans 12 of presenting ourselves as a living sacrifice?
Absolutely, yes. I think this is on again. Yeah. I absolutely think that this impacts how we read Romans 12, and we will talk about that, God willing, tomorrow. But to anticipate, I think what's going on in Romans 12 is at its core Christomorphic. It is based on, the paradigm for this is Jesus himself, who presents his own blood and flesh to the Father, which then creates the conditions whereby we can approach the presence of the Father and present our blood and flesh as living sacrifice, right? Which is what Paul says. Everybody thinks like, oh, Paul's doing something funny there. Like it's a sacrifice that's alive. But actually, if life is at the core of sacrifice, he might just be doing something very Jewish there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have read a bit of J.S. Glass' work. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
Yeah. And, as far as I remember, he speaks of the sin offering as a kind of compensation. What is your opinion on that?
I was initially persuaded by Sklar's work that because of the link with Kippur and Kofar, I think is it Kofar or Kofar? Anyway, because there is a lexical connection, it's the same root, KPR, that maybe there's a way of seeing this. The more I've tried to make it play out, the less persuaded I am. It seems to me that redemption, ransom, is something that's distinct and separate from what happens. And I mean, this gets us into much bigger questions, but let me see if I can briefly say this clearly. I am absolutely persuaded that there are texts like Isaiah 53 which are doing something that looks like what we might today call a penal substitution. That there is some way in which the servant figure is bearing punishment for the sake of the sins of the people, and that has a positive salvific effect. What I am not persuaded of any longer, I could be wrong, but what I'm not persuaded of any longer is that Isaiah 53 is drawing on sacrificial ideas. It looks to me like Isaiah 53 is extra sacrificial, extraordinary, precisely because it's a mechanism to help solve a certain problem when one finds oneself in a position in which the very thing you can't do is offer a sacrifice to God, because the covenant has been broken. The temple doesn't even stand. Sacrifice cannot be given to God. How can that relationship be restored? Isaiah 53 allows for a sort of, well, you can't be sort of unique, but something that is, I think, unique in Hebrew Bible discourse for restoring that relationship. Only after the relationship is restored do the people then return to Jerusalem. Presumably the temple and the covenant are reestablished and sacrifice begins to occur again. In other words, Isaiah 54, 55, 56 follows Isaiah 53. Okay, so sorry, that's a bit lengthy, but that's a way of saying that it now seems to me that these categories actually are somewhat distinct. And even though there is a lexical link there, again, the etymology doesn't tell the whole story. And I don't see within Levitical sacrifice a way of resolving the problem of wrath. I can see a way in which Levitical sacrifice helps prevent wrath from coming, but the mechanism itself doesn't seem to be one of redemption or ransom from God, which is, I think, the only way that Sklar's logic would ultimately have to work. You have to be redeemed from God. I find that an odd, the more I've tried to play with that idea, the harder it is for me to accept that as what's going on. There's a lot behind it, right? I mean, already Calvin is going to be, if you'll forgive, like, just to make a point, already Calvin, who's really keen on holding on to the descent into hell, is going to demythologize the descent into hell as Jesus bearing the wrath of God. And I just wonder if that's a correct move, because what gets missed there is defeating the devil. I don't know, these are deeper waters. Maybe if you want, we can unpack it more. But there's something that I think needs to not get lost here, that what you're being ransomed and redeemed from is actually the devil. It's not, you're not being ransomed from God. You're being redeemed to God. So I don't know if that's helpful, but Jay Sklar, I'm sure would have lots to push back